Shalom, and welcome to our show, The Crossover, a show aimed at bridging gaps between Jews and Christians. For those of you who are viewing The Crossover who aren't aware that the father of the Reformation, Martin Luther, is the man whose late anti-Jewish writings inspired Hitler for his final solution, that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Today we have Dr. Franklin Sherman, who has been instrumental in leading the ELCA, which is the the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, to the repudiation of Luther's anti-Semitic diatribes. He's the former director of the Institute for Jewish Christian Understanding at Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania, and has been a visiting professor at universities in the United States, Switzerland, Ireland, Japan, and Zimbabwe. He's written numerous essays and reviews on theology and ethics and interfaith relations, and he has done research in Israel at the Ecumenical Institute for Theological Studies and the Shalom Hartman Institute. We're happy to have him here. Enjoy him and Mitch.
For nearly 2,000 years, Jews and Christians have been divided. But now, God is calling for the healing of past hurts and the comforting of His people. Discover how God is prophetically uniting Jews and Christians across the world today on The Crossover. And now, here is your host, Mitch Jerome.
Dr. Sherman, welcome to our show, The Crossover. Thank you, Mitch. Glad that we know you came from Pennsylvania to talk here at the Holocaust Museum, and we're a part of that. I want to ask you a couple questions here. I'm going to read here on a statement Luther had written on his tract on the Jews and their lies. And it's not easy to read this, but for historical purposes, we want our audience to be aware of this. In this he wrote, quote, "Know this, Christians, you have no greater enemy than the Jews." His tract called for the enslavement of the Jews because they were children of the devil and should never touch a Christian's hand. Luther demanded that their synagogues be burned to the ground, their books destroyed, their homes laid waste, their cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them, their rabbis be forbidden to teach, and their tongues be cut out from their throats. He also advised that young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the distaff, the spindle, and let them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses, as is enjoined upon Adam's children. We ought to drive the lazy bones out of our system. And we know that was back in 1543, or thereabouts, and that is not the stand by any means of the current Lutheran Church, and we want you just to comment on that.
Well, Mitch, you've plunged into the very worst of that long treatise that Luther wrote. As you know, earlier in his life, Luther was very favorably disposed towards the Jews. He wrote some beautiful things about Jewish faith and Jewish tradition, but he did hope that they would convert to Christianity. And when they didn't, he became, as I said, disappointed and disillusioned and finally enraged about it all. I'm not sure that every point that you mentioned there is in Luther's works in those exact words. There are a couple of those things I don't recognize, but most of them I do, I'm afraid. And this was a period of Luther's old age. He was ill, but those are not excuses for this kind of attack and hatred. It was largely a part of the late medieval situation. There was a lot of superstition and stereotyping of the Jews at that time, and Luther was able to free himself from it for a while, but I'm afraid in his older years he fell back into it again. However, as you said today, we have completely repudiated and renounced these writings and these views.
And again, Luther has brought a lot of good, obviously, with the Reformation and all the good works that came in those times. And you have shared tonight too, Doctor, that a lot of, even though there's rhetoric and diatribe that went on, not a lot of it there was not much action that came forth from it, from the Lutheran side there. But I know that Hitler was a student of Luther's later works there, and he had applied it to, I think he even went into one of, I'm not sure if it was Poland, but one of the countries, and on the day of Luther's birthday, as a reward or a recognition of Luther to attack that country in that day. That's what a little bit of readings have shown. But are there any more modern areas where seepage has come forth from this type of past that we should be aware of?
Yes, there are. You know there is such a thing as neo-Nazi movements in Europe, and I'm afraid in America too. They, perhaps in remote places like Idaho, and some of them have been disbanded and transcended. But these movements, hate groups of various kinds, love to quote from Martin Luther. And that's one reason we in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America were convinced that we had to renounce them, so no one would confuse those writings from almost 500 years ago with the views that we have today, which are very appreciative and positive towards Jews and Judaism.
Share with us, Dr. Luther, Dr. Sherman, the works that you have, the guidelines that you have come forth here for the Lutheran and Jewish relations. And it's a 15-point guideline that you have, but this came forth in what year now?
Well, there are three things that we've done, sort of in 4-year periods. In 1994, we issued what's called the Declaration of the Evangelical Lutheran Church to the Jewish community. And it's in that document that we renounced these views and these writings of Luther and said we would like to live henceforth, quote, with love and respect for the Jewish people. And then in 1998, as a follow-up, we adopted a set of guidelines to guide our clergy and congregations in opening up local relationships, dialogues, discussions, take the Lutheran confirmation class to visit the synagogue, have the bar mitzvah students learn about Christianity, and it's very practical matters like that. And more recently, we have issued these talking points, which is a set of discussion materials. These came out only about 1 year ago. Discussion materials on topics in Christian-Jewish relations, which we hope will be used in many, many of our congregations across the country.
And how, so in '98, when the recommendations had come forth for the Lutherans to take the initiative to reach out to the Jewish community, and how has that been going? It's only 5 years ago.
Yes. Well, it's been going rather well. We find that often the Jewish community will take the initiative, also in reaching out to Christians, which we welcome very much. But we're urging our people to do so. And also, I might say, not just Lutherans and Jews, but to take the initiative in gathering a kind of coalition of Christians who can enter into this kind of dialogue and interchange. There are many instances, some of which are recounted on our website called www.elca.org. If you search there under Jewish or words like that, you'll find quite a few stories of things that have happened locally of the sort you're mentioning.
And share with us also your other website that you mentioned tonight for Jewish and Christian relations.
Yes, well, there's a website called www.jcrelations.net, and it is a comprehensive website, international and ecumenical and interfaith in nature, which presents documentation, articles, book reviews, news, conference reports, and whatnot from all over the place having to do with Christian-Jewish relations. www.jcrelations.net.
I just wanted to share point number 5, the 15 points that you have here, and you shared some other things about going to seders and bar mitzvahs and really having a dialogue with the communities between the Jews and the Christians. And number 5, it states like this: it should be understood that the aim of such conversation is not shallow tolerance or mere surface agreement, but greater self-understanding and mutual enrichment. Honest differences will remain, even as broad areas of commonality are discovered. That gives a lot of hope for any kind of religions to be able to sit down and truly dialogue and still have a mutual respect for each other. And we don't see a lot of that sometimes in the events going on in the world today.
Very true.
Dr. Sherman, what was it that created the spark in you to spend so much of your life and times in this arena? Was there one event?
Well, I've been asked that question before, and I would say there were two roots, one negative and one positive in nature. Negatively, I grew up in an area in eastern Pennsylvania in which there was not a lot of anti-black prejudice because there weren't many blacks there to be prejudiced against. And But so the problem was anti-Jewish. I sort of experienced anti-Semitism as I was growing up in my own family and context. Not from the church, but in the community as a whole. That was the negative route. As an idealistic young person, I saw that as something I needed to work to overcome. The second was when I began to study theology, I came across the writings of great Jewish scholars and philosophers and theologians, such as, for example, Abraham Joshua Heschel, writings which were so inspiring to me and which fed my own faith as a Christian that I was drawn even further into the matter through that.
It seems like, why were there not predecessors to Dr. Sherman that were coming out with this? This was now almost 500 years ago from these writings that Luther had, and you are the voice out here right now in the world, but where were your predecessors to bring this forth?
Well, there were predecessors. There was a very marvelous Lutheran professor and theologian named Harold Dittmanson, who was a generation before me, and there was a major scholar in England, James Parks, who was working on this matter from the 1920s and 30s on. But we simply today have tried to take it further.
And you shared tonight, I believe, that even a lot of the leaders of the Lutheran community themselves were even not aware of these writings. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, that's true. I mean, the very words that you read at the beginning, Mitch, are probably going to be shocking to most all of the viewers that you have for your show, whether they're Christian or Jewish or whatever kind of Christian they are. Because these are tucked away, as I said in my speech, in volume 47 of the 55 volumes of Luther's works. Even most clergy have not been aware, Lutheran clergy have not been aware of them until recently. The point is, though, they were known to these anti-Semitic groups and were being used by them, and that's why we knew we had to come forth and, as it were, uncover this darker side of our history and put it aside, denounce it.
We're grateful for that effort. And then, in closing, Dr. Sherman, what was it that you'd like to tell our viewers? I mean, for the ones that weren't here tonight to hear this 2 hours of the talk that we had and sharing, but what would you like for people to take with them from tonight and remember from this event?
Well, I'd like to say that we are indeed in a new day in Christian-Jewish relations. There is still a lot of anti-Semitism. Fortunately, not so much here in America. We can be glad for that, but in Europe it's quite virulent at the present time. And so we need to be aware of the new attitudes that are official church statements, not only from our denomination, but from other Protestant churches, from the Roman Catholic Church at the highest level, the way in which these statements have called upon us to move beyond what I call the teaching of contempt to a teaching of respect for the Jewish people and for their religious heritage. We need to be on our guard against what is still there of hostility and even hatred, but we need to capitalize upon this new moment of mutual appreciation and affirmation.
And now a few excerpts from the panel discussion. Enjoy.
Martin Luther and Judaism. It's difficult from a historical point of view to understand how a person of Luther's stature, and one who earlier in his career had expressed so positive an attitude towards the Jews and Judaism, by the last years of his life was indulging in some of the most ferocious anti-Jewish rhetoric in the history of Christendom. And it's difficult also from a contemporary point of view to know how to deal with these writings, which are still being used by certain groups to fan the flames of anti-Semitism. The term anti-Judaism is commonly used to refer to hostility to or a demeaning attitude towards Judaism as a religious faith. The faith of which, of course, the Jewish people has been the bearer, although one can also be a secular Jew. Anti-Judaism, in this sense, hostility to or a demeaning attitude towards Judaism as a religious faith, has, we must admit, been fostered by certain elements in Christian teaching down through the centuries that have been summed up as the theology of replacement, or supersessionism. That is, the view that Christianity, as the superior religion, has completely superseded Judaism as an inferior one. More bluntly, this view has been called the teaching of contempt by the great French Jewish scholar Jules Isaac in his book of the same name. And we could summarize the aim of our interfaith efforts today, on the Christian side certainly, as being to replace this teaching of contempt with a teaching of respect. But in any case, that is the meaning of anti-Judaism. The term anti-Semitism, on the other hand, is usually used to refer to discrimination against, or more strongly, hatred of, Jews as Jews. In other words, as human beings, regardless of the extent to which they do or do not practice the Jewish faith. Now, the term anti-Semitism, as many of you no doubt know, was coined in the 19th century and was inextricably intertwined with the theories of racial superiority and inferiority that found their worst expression in Nazism. For this reason, it is often held that it is anachronistic to apply this term anti-Semitism to an earlier historical figure like Martin Luther, since his objection to the Jews, it is said, was religious and not racial. His problem was not that the Jews were in any sense inferior as people, but simply that they would not accept Jesus as the Messiah, and it was for that reason that he called them blind, obstinate, and so on. Now, it's true that that was Luther's main objection, but by the last decade of his life, he had come to couple that with the whole witch's brew of the worst of the medieval demonic image of the Jews. The Jews were the poisoners of wells. They kidnapped and killed Christian children in order to mix their blood into the Passover months. They were greedy usurers who fleeced and defrauded innocent Christians, and so on. The late Middle Ages was not one of the shining periods in Christian-Jewish relations, far from it. And Luther, certainly in his view of the Jews, was very much a child of his age. What is surprising is that for a brief period in his life, he rose above this inherited view. In 1523, remember we date the Reformation commonly from 1517. In 1523, in the full flush of the Reformation, and before his opposition to the Peasants' Rebellion had disillusioned many about his intentions. In other words, at the height of his powers, he wrote a remarkable treatise called That Jesus Christ was Born a Jew. It could also be translated that Jesus Christ was a born Jew. Dass Jesus Christus ein geborener Jude war. And here, Luther wrote in a very different manner about the Jews than he was to do later. And I quote, "Our fools, the popes, bishops, sophists, and monks, the crude asses' heads," you'll excuse me, but this was typical language for Luther, "have hitherto so treated the Jews that anyone who wished to be a good Christian would almost have had to become a Jew. They have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property." And he goes on, "If the apostles, the original followers of Jesus, who also were Jews, had dealt with us Gentiles as we Gentiles deal with the Jews, there would never have been a Christian among the Gentiles. Since they dealt with us Gentiles in such a brotherly fashion, we in our turn ought to treat the Jews in a brotherly fashion. But now notice how he concludes. We ought also to treat the Jews in a brotherly manner, in order that we might convert some of them. So that is the joker in the deck. Luther was indeed interested for a time in a new and more positive attitude and practice towards the Jews, but with the aim and the expectation of conversion. When that didn't happen, he was disappointed. And as time went on, more and more distressed, and then enraged. And so it is that he comes to his infamous recommendations. That is his term in the latter part of his treatise. You must know these things as those who have come to learn about Martin Luther and Judaism. His recommendations include the following: to set fire to their synagogues or schools, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn, so that no one will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. That their houses also be razed and destroyed, for they pursue in them the same aims as in the synagogues. Instead, they might be lodged under a roof or in a barn like the gypsies. That all their prayer books and Talmudic writings, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught, be taken from them. That their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth, on pain of loss of life and limb. And so on. I don't want to cite all of his painful recommendations, so-called, which conclude with this, that the most reasonable thing would be simply to expel them from the country. In short, we have to say, and this is not generally put so plainly, but I think we have to say, that Luther was propounding his own version of the Nuremberg laws and recommending his own equivalent of Kristallnacht. In order to be fair to him and to history, we have to be clear that he did not go so far as the final solution or anything like genocide. And for most of subsequent Lutheran history, which is now stretched on for nigh on to 500 years, these writings remained largely unknown. Indeed, those of you here who are not Lutheran should be aware that most members of our denomination, including those who are here today, members of Christ the King Lutheran Church, have never heard these precise words. And indeed, most Lutheran clergy had never heard them or even heard of them until this past 10 years or so, when they have come to greater public attention. But the problem is that these writings were known to anti-Semitic movements and hate groups of all kinds, both here in the United States and in Germany and elsewhere. And one can also find reprints of the original parts of this treatise on the Jews and their lies put out in pamphlet form, often with that title, so you might think it was originally a pamphlet rather than a 200-page treatise. A pamphlet form put out in this country, for example, by the Ku Klux Klan, already in the 1920s. More recently by the Aryan Nations and other neo-Nazi groups. And I'm afraid also sold at the literature tables of the Nation of Islam. That is the Louis Farrakhan group, not to be confused with the mainstream of Islam. With regard to the Jewish response to all of this, I don't know whether most of you are familiar with the Jewish statement that was issued in the fall of, I think, 2001, called Dabru Emet, meaning to speak the truth. Subtitled A Jewish Statement on Christians and Christianity, which was instigated by Professor Michael Signer, Professor of Jewish Studies at Notre Dame University. That's also a very interesting book to hold. And some of his close colleagues at other Jewish positions, and which is specifically designed to do this. As the statement says, Christians have been rather drastically reconsidering their attitude toward us Jews and Judaism. Is it not time for us Jews to reconsider our attitude toward our stereotypes of, our ignorance of Christianity? So if you haven't attended to that statement, indeed it would be worth holding a symposium on that very statement if it has not already been done here at Holocaust Museum East.
I would like to read you one of my favorite quotes. It is by Dr. Richard Bucher, who is the director of the Institute for Hebraic Christian Studies here in Houston. I don't know if Dr. Bucher is in the audience, but anyway. He said, "When we understand that Christians and Jews have theological differences, we do not have to agree on theology in order to love one another. And if we cannot love one another, what good is our theology?"
Join Mitch and Rosalie as they reach an ever-growing worldwide audience through the crossover. We invite you to become a crossover partner right now by calling the number on your screen. For your monthly gift of $30 or more, you will receive the Crossover Partnership Pack, which includes a DVD of today's program, a personal greeting and prayer message from Mitch and Rosalie, more information about the Crossover Project. As you continue to support the Crossover each month, you will receive a new Crossover DVD, a monthly ministry report, and your name will be added to the Healing Room. Call now or log on to our website and join the growing family of Crossover Partners. And be sure to join us again next week as Mitch and Rosalie tackle timely topics and welcome dynamic guests on The Crossover.
Lord God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, let it be known today that you are God. We offer up our lives as a living sacrifice. Purify us with your holy fire. Holy fire, you are the Holy One, highly exalted One. We've come to worship at your holy hill. You are the Holy One, highly exalted One, and we surrender to your sovereign will. Oh Lord God of Abraham, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, let it be known today that you are God. There is no other one like you. Come now and fill this place. Be exalted in